The morning after the storm, 3 men rode out across the Kansas plains to count what was left. Not much. A neighbor's barn gone. Another family's roof. Carried half a mile east and dropped into a dry creek bed like a piece of crumpled paper. A stone well that had stood for 11 years had been knocked sideways at the foundation, its coping stones scattered in a 50-yard arc. The sky was pale and still now, almost apologetic. The grass lay flat in every direction, pressed to the ground as if something immense had dragged itself across the land in the night. And then one of the men stopped his horse. There was, or rather, there wasn't, a shallow depression in the earth, barely noticeable from a distance. A low mound of sod and packed clay, maybe 18 inches above the surrounding grade. A rusted iron wheel rim poking out at an odd angle. And nothing else. No debris. No damage. Not even a scratch in the soil around it. Everything within a quarter-mile had been touched. Everything except that. The men looked at each other. One of them had ridden past that spot dozens of times and never given it a second thought. A hole. A worthless dip in the ground with some junk piled over it. That's all he'd ever seen. But the family who lived inside, it had slept through the worst cyclone in a decade. How? That question doesn't have a simple answer. And that's exactly the point. Because what happened on that piece of ground wasn't luck. It wasn't providence. It was a decision made months earlier, in desperation, with broken materials and borrowed time. A decision that almost everyone who heard about it had dismissed as foolish, impractical, even dangerous. The real story starts with a wrecked wagon, a hole in the earth that nobody wanted, and a man who had absolutely no other choice. If you've never heard of this kind of shelter before, you're not alone. It was never famous. It was never celebrated. It was just quietly, stubbornly effective in the way that things built under pressure sometimes are. If this is your first time here, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We've got viewers from Montana to the Scottish Highlands, and we want to hear from all of you. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand what happened on that patch of Kansas ground, you have to understand what the Great Plains looked like in the early 1870s, before the railroads pushed deep into the interior, before the lumber yards, before the hardware merchants, and the grain elevators, and the neat little courthouse towns with their white-painted steeples. You have to understand what it meant to arrive at a place where there was almost nothing. No trees. That was the first shock for most settlers coming from the forested East or from Central Europe. They stepped off a wagon, looked in every direction, and saw grass. Just grass. Bluestem and buffalo grass and switchgrass, stretching flat and uninterrupted to a horizon that seemed farther away than any horizon had a right to be. The sky was enormous here, almost aggressive in its openness, and the wind moved across the land without mercy, without obstacle, without any memory of the forest it had left behind hundreds of miles east. Oral accounts from early settlers in Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakota Territory describe a particular silence that was not peaceful. It was the silence of exposure. A man standing on the prairie felt watched by something indifferent and enormous. He was the tallest object for miles in every direction. And in winter, with temperatures dropping to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit and winds driving snow horizontally across the flats, that exposure became a question of survival. Not comfort, survival. Timber was the currency of frontier life, and on the Great Plains, it was almost non-existent. Local records from several Kansas counties in the 1870s note that a single wagon load of rough-cut lumber, enough to frame a modest single-room structure, could cost more than 2 months of a farmhand's wages when freighted in from the east. Cottonwood grew along the creek beds, but it was soft, it warped badly when dried, and it didn't hold a nail well under the stress of the prairie wind. Stone existed in some regions. Limestone outcroppings ran in irregular bands across eastern Kansas. But quarrying and shaping stone required tools and time that most new arrivals didn't have. What most settlers had was a wagon, a team of oxen or horses, hand tools, and whatever they'd managed to pack into the wagon box before leaving home. That was it. And the winter didn't wait. It arrived, according to multiple homestead accounts from the period, with almost no warning, sometimes as early as October, dropping temperatures by 40 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of hours. A family that hadn't secured shelter before the first hard freeze was in genuine danger. Not the romantic danger of frontier adventure stories, but the quiet, grinding danger of cold that seeps through canvas and thin board walls and steals warmth from sleeping children through the long, dark hours of a January night. This was the environment that shaped the decisions that would be made. Not philosophy, not aesthetics, not personal style. Pure, relentless, physical pressure. The man at the center of this story, identified in a faded county land record only as E. Calloway, arrived in central Kansas sometime in the late summer of 1873 with his wife, 2 young children, a team of oxen, a heavily loaded wagon, and a claim to 160 acres of flat, treeless prairie that the Homestead Act had offered him for nothing but 5 years of his life. He had come from western Ohio, where timber was plentiful and winters were hard but manageable. He knew how to build. He knew how to work. What he didn't know, what no amount of Eastern experience could have prepared him for, was the particular cruelty of a Kansas winter on open ground with no materials to build from. He had less than 8 weeks before the first serious cold would arrive. And then the wagon broke. It happened 3 miles from the claim, on a shallow creek crossing that local accounts describe as deceptively solid during dry weather. The lead oxen stepped across without issue, but when the wagon's right front wheel dropped into a hidden soft spot beneath the gravel, the frame torqued hard to one side. Calloway heard the crack before he felt the lurch, a sharp, dense sound, the kind that settlers learned to dread because it meant something structural had failed, not just bent. The rear axle had snapped, not cracked, snapped clean, the iron fatigue brake leaving a surface that looked almost surgical in its cleanness. He stood in the creek bed for what local oral tradition suggests was a long time, looking at the broken axle and doing the mathematics of a situation. The nearest blacksmith capable of forging a replacement axle was more than 40 miles east in a town that had a name but barely qualified as a settlement. The round trip, assuming he could hire a wagon to make it, would take at least 5 days. The repair itself would cost money he didn't have to spare, and the wagon, once repaired, would still need to be hauled back out of the creek, reloaded, and driven to the claim. 5 days. In a season where every day of good weather was a day of shelter building he couldn't afford to lose. He unloaded the wagon in the creek bed, carrying each piece up the bank by hand. The cast-iron cook stove, the tool chest, the seed bags, the household goods wrapped in canvas. He drove the oxen back to the claim with what they could pull on a makeshift sled. He left the wagon where it sat. Or rather, he left most of it. Over the next 2 days, he stripped the wagon down to its essential components with a methodical attention that those who knew him later described as characteristic of his thinking. The canvas cover, still mostly intact. The iron wheel rims, all 4 of them. The broken axle pieces. The hardwood wagon bows. The curved ribs that had supported the canvas. The sideboards, which were relatively sound. The wagon box floor planks. The tongue, which was a solid piece of hickory nearly 14 feet long. Everything that could be unfastened, he unfastened. Everything that could be pried loose, he pried loose. He stacked the pieces in a pile on the bank, harnessed the oxen, and dragged the pile across 3 miles of prairie grass to his claim. What he arrived with was not building materials in any conventional sense. No one looking at that pile of iron rims and bent hickory bows and rough planks would have seen shelter. They would have seen junk, wreckage, the remains of something that had been useful and was no longer. But Calloway wasn't looking at what those materials had been. He was looking at what they could become. He spent that evening walking the perimeter of his 160 acres in the fading light, looking at the land with a different kind of attention. Not the attention of a farmer counting potential yield per acre. The attention of a man trying to find something the land itself was offering, some feature, some accident of geology or drainage that he could use. Something the open, featureless prairie almost never provided. He found it near the northwest corner of the claim. A sinkhole, roughly oval, about 12 feet across at the widest point and nearly 6 feet deep at the center. The walls were dry and relatively stable, compressed clay and silt, the kind of soil that holds its shape when dry but becomes treacherous when wet. The bottom was flat and hard. It had probably been formed by the slow collapse of a subsurface limestone layer, a process common in that part of Kansas, where shallow karst formations occasionally gave way without warning. The neighbors who had already staked claims nearby, two families within visible distance, knew about the hole. They'd ridden around it and dismissed it. One of them, according to a recollection recorded decades later by his son, had called it a hazard, a place where a horse could break a leg, a place to fill in someday, if you ever had the time. Calloway stood at the edge of it in the dark and thought about something else entirely. The decision he made that night was not impulsive. People who make impulsive decisions in survival situations usually don't survive long enough for their stories to be recorded. What Calloway did over the following 2 days, as reconstructed from the land record, from a partial letter he wrote to a brother in Ohio that somehow survived, and from accounts passed down through a neighboring family, was methodical, deliberate, and informed by a clear understanding of what he had and what he needed. What he had: a sinkhole 6 feet deep and 12 feet across, broken wagon components, a cast-iron cook stove, hand tools, his own labor and his wife's. Perhaps 6 weeks of reasonable weather remaining before the Kansas cold made outdoor construction miserable and then impossible. What he needed: a structure that could hold warmth, resist wind, shelter 4 people through a plains winter, and be built without timber, without stone, and without outside help. The sinkhole solved 3 of his most critical problems simultaneously, and this is the part that most people, hearing the story for the first time, tend to underestimate. First, it gave him walls. Not walls he had to build from scarce materials. Walls the earth itself had already formed. Compressed clay walls, nearly vertical, 6 feet high around most of the perimeter. Walls with thermal mass, because clay, like stone, absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. A clay wall 6 feet thick, and the undisturbed soil beyond the sinkhole's edge was effectively infinite in depth. Doesn't care what the temperature does on the surface. At 6 feet below grade, the ground temperature in central Kansas stays between 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of whether the air above is 100 degrees Fahrenheit in August or minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit in January. The earth is its own furnace, burning fuel laid down over geological time. Second, it gave him a foundation that required no digging, no leveling, and no lumber formwork. The flat, hard-packed clay at the bottom of the sinkhole was already a floor. Third, and this is the detail that becomes critical later when the cyclone arrives, it gave him a structure with almost no vertical profile above the surrounding grade. A structure that the wind would have almost nothing to grab. He spent the first day of construction lowering the wagon components into the hole by hand, using the ox team and a rope rigged through a pulley made from one of the iron wheel rims. The heavy wagon box floor planks went down first, laid across the bottom of the hole to keep the living surface above the damp clay. Then the wagon bows, those curved hickory ribs, were set upright and lashed together at the peak to form a low, arched roof frame spanning the width of the sinkhole. At their highest point, they rose perhaps 3 feet above the rim of the hole. 3 feet. That was the total above-grade height of the structure. The canvas wagon cover went over the bows, stretched tight, and pegged to the outer rim of the sinkhole with iron stakes cut from the broken axle. Then came the sod. His wife, whose name does not appear in the surviving records, but whose contribution to the construction is referenced explicitly in Calloway's letter, cut sod blocks from the surrounding prairie using a spade and a sharpened plank edge. Standard plains sod blocks of the period ran roughly 12 inches wide, 24 inches long, and 4 inches thick, dense, root-bound, heavy as wet concrete. She cut and stacked while he laid. They worked a full day covering the canvas with 2 overlapping courses of sod, grass side down against the canvas, root side up. The total sod load on the roof frame came to an estimated 2,800 to 3,200 pounds, well within what the hickory bows could support given their arch geometry, which distributed the load outward to the sinkhole walls rather than downward to a central point. When they finished, the structure was almost invisible from more than 30 yards away. A low mound of fresh-cut sod, barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. A narrow entry passage on the south face. A trench cut into the sinkhole wall at an angle, roofed with planks and a final layer of sod, led down into the interior. The cast-iron stove went in last, its flue pipe rising through a carefully cut hole in the sod roof and capped with an angled iron sheet to keep rain out. The neighbors came to look. One of them laughed, not unkindly. The laughter of a man genuinely uncertain whether what he was looking at was a shelter or a grave. "You're going to live in a hole," he said, according to his son's recollection. Calloway answered that he was going to live. The distinction he seemed to feel was important. To understand why what Calloway built actually worked, thermally, structurally, and ultimately against the wind, it helps to think about what most frontier shelters of the period were doing wrong. Not through ignorance or laziness, but through habit. Habit carried from places where the rules were different. A standard frame cabin of the 1870s, built from rough-cut lumber on the open prairie, was essentially a box sitting on the surface of the ground. For walls, a peaked roof, a door, a window or two, a fireplace or cast-iron stove inside. If the materials were good and the construction was careful, it could be a decent shelter. But it had fundamental thermal vulnerabilities that its builders often didn't fully account for. The walls were thin, typically 1 to 2 inches of wood, sometimes with a layer of tar paper or batting added for insulation, but never more than a few inches of actual thermal resistance. On a night when the wind was driving at 30 miles per hour and the temperature had dropped to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the effective chill against those walls was brutal. The cabin's interior lost heat through the walls, through the floor, which sat directly on cold ground or on a shallow crawl space, through the roof, and dramatically through any gap or crack where the wood had shrunk in the dry prairie air. Maintaining a livable temperature, somewhere above 45 degrees Fahrenheit, in a standard frame cabin on the open Kansas prairie on a bad winter night required burning wood almost continuously. Local accounts from homestead diaries of the period describe families burning 8 to 12 cords of wood over a single winter. Wood that, on the treeless plains, had to be hauled from creek beds or purchased at significant expense. Families who ran out of wood before spring ended up burning hay, dried cattle dung, and, in documented cases of desperation, their own furniture. Calloway's earth shelter operated on entirely different physics. The sod and clay envelope surrounding the living space had a thermal mass equivalent to several feet of stone. Thermal mass, in simple terms, is a material's ability to absorb heat, store it, and release it slowly over time. Clay and compacted soil are not excellent insulators in the way that modern fiberglass batting is. They conduct some heat, but they store enormous amounts of thermal energy and release it so slowly that the interior temperature stays remarkably stable regardless of what the surface is doing. At 6 feet below grade, the effective depth of the sinkhole's floor, the surrounding soil maintained a relatively constant temperature between 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit. This meant that on a night when the air temperature on the surface dropped to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, the earth walls of a shelter were not cold. They were warm. Not warm the way a heated room is warm, but warm relative to the killing cold outside. The soil was a thermal battery, charged by the previous summer's heat, releasing it slowly through the winter months. The small cast-iron stove inside the shelter didn't need to work hard under these conditions. It wasn't fighting a wall temperature of minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit the way a surface cabin stove would be. It was supplementing an ambient earth temperature of roughly 52 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant it only needed to raise the interior by about 16 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit to reach a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The fuel savings were dramatic. Where a surface cabin might require a full armload of wood every 2 to 3 hours through the night, Calloway's shelter, based on his own description in the surviving letter fragment, required stoking only 2 or 3 times across a 12-hour night. An estimated 60 to 65% reduction in fuel consumption compared to a standard frame structure of similar floor area. The arched geometry of the wagon bow roof served a second structural purpose beyond simply holding up the sod. An arch distributes load outward along its curve, transferring force to its supports at the base rather than trying to resist it at the center. The wagon bows, bent into their original curve for carrying cargo, were already shaped for exactly this kind of load distribution. The 3,000 pounds of sod pressing down on the canvas and bows was transferred outward to the compressed clay walls of the sinkhole, which were far stronger in compression than any surface foundation Callaway could have built from available materials. The entry trench, that angled passage cut into the south wall, served as a thermal airlock. Cold air entering from outside had to travel down, turn, and travel up again before reaching the interior. Cold air is denser than warm air. It sinks rather than rises. The geometry of the entry passage meant that the coldest incoming air fell to the bottom of the trench and stayed there, while the warmer interior air remained stratified above it. It was a passive heat retention feature that required no moving parts, no fuel, and no maintenance, just a particular shape cut into the earth. None of this was magic. All of it was physics. Physics that the Earth itself had been performing for geological ages, long before any human thought to use it for shelter. The question was whether it would hold when the real test came. The first morning Callaway woke up inside the finished shelter, the temperature on the Kansas surface had dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit. He could hear the wind moving across the sod roof above him. Not the howl he'd learned to dread in Ohio during bad winters, but a lower, almost bored sound, as if the wind were passing over something it had decided wasn't worth engaging with. Inside the shelter, according to the letter fragment he wrote that winter, it was 61 degrees Fahrenheit. He had not lit the stove since the previous evening. This was the moment, he wrote, when he understood what he had actually built. Not just a shelter, a thermal storage vessel, something that had been absorbing the ambient warmth of the surrounding soil all night and returning it into the living space at a rate that almost exactly matched the slow heat loss through the sod roof above. The system was in rough equilibrium. Not perfect, not luxurious, but stable. Stable in a way that a frame cabin sitting on frozen ground in 22 degrees Fahrenheit air could never be without continuous fuel. To understand why, it helps to think about what below grade means thermally. Soil is a remarkable thermal buffer. Unlike air, which transfers heat almost instantly to whatever it touches, soil conducts heat extremely slowly. The technical term is thermal diffusivity, the rate at which a temperature change at the surface penetrates downward through the earth. In typical clay-silt soil of the kind found across central Kansas, a temperature change at the surface takes weeks to months to reach a depth of 6 feet. This means that the ground at 6 feet deep is not responding to today's weather, or last week's weather, or even last month's weather. It is responding to the average temperature of the past several months, the accumulated thermal memory of the previous season. In central Kansas, that memory was warm. Summer ground temperatures at 6 feet reach between 70 degrees Fahrenheit and 75 degrees Fahrenheit by late August, and they bleed downward into autumn slowly, arriving at their seasonal minimum, around 48 degrees Fahrenheit to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, not in January, but in late February or early March, weeks after the coldest air temperatures have already passed. This lag, called the thermal phase shift, meant that the earth walls of Callaway's shelter were warmest at exactly the moment when the prairie surface was coldest. The soil was releasing stored summer heat into the shelter precisely during the worst weeks of winter. The sod roof contributed a different but complementary mechanism. Sod, live grass, and its dense root matrix, is a genuinely effective insulator. The air spaces trapped between root fibers, the moisture held in the soil component, and the living grass above all work together to slow heat transfer between the warm interior and the cold exterior. 2 courses of 4-inch sod blocks, stacked to a total thickness of 8 to 10 inches, provided an insulating layer comparable in performance to several inches of modern fiberglass batting. Not equal, but meaningfully similar and available at zero cost anywhere on the plains. The canvas layer beneath the sod served as a vapor barrier and wind membrane. It prevented cold air infiltration through the sod's natural porosity and kept moisture from the sod from dripping into the living space below. The wagon canvas was already lanolin treated from its time on the trail, a natural water resistance that, while imperfect, added useful months of moisture protection before it began to break down. Calloway's wife managed the stove with a precision that he credited explicitly in his letter, a careful, rhythmic management of fuel and draft that kept the interior between 62 degrees Fahrenheit and 68 degrees Fahrenheit using roughly half the wood he had estimated would be needed. She had built a small raised shelf near the stove from wagon board scraps and filled it with smooth creek stones, each about the size of a man's fist. These stones absorbed heat from the stove during the burning hours and re-radiated it gently through the night after the fire was banked. A secondary thermal mass within the primary thermal mass of the shelter itself. Layered heat storage, simple and effective. The children slept warmly. The oxen, sheltered in a rough windbreak trench dug adjacent to the main shelter and roofed with a single layer of sod over stacked plank, survived the winter without the respiratory illness that killed livestock across the open-penned neighboring farms. The stored food, root vegetables, dried corn, salt-preserved meat, stayed at stable temperature throughout, neither freezing solid nor warming enough to spoil. By the time the first hard freeze broke in early March, Calloway had burned roughly 2.1 cords of wood. His nearest neighbor, in a comparable surface frame structure of similar floor area, had burned just over 5 cords, and had still reported 2 nights when the interior temperature fell below 35 degrees Fahrenheit despite continuous stoking. The difference was not the stove. It was not the wood quality. It was the physics of where the heat was being asked to live. One structure was fighting the winter. The other was hiding from it, in the one place the winter couldn't reach. Word traveled quickly on the open plains. Not because people gossiped, or not only because of that, but because distances between claims were short enough that a man could see his neighbor's roof from his own doorstep, and the absence of natural barriers meant that anything unusual became visible and therefore notable. Calloway's mound was unusual from the first day it appeared. The reactions, reconstructed from a neighboring family's later accounts, and from a brief reference in a county newspaper item dated to the spring of 1874, ranged from skeptical to openly dismissive. The most persistent criticism was structural. A sod roof over a wagon bow frame, the neighbors argued, would collapse under the first heavy snowfall. Snow on the plains doesn't fall gently. It packs hard and accumulates fast, driven by wind into drifts that can exceed 5 feet in depth. The weight of a serious snowpack on a roof structure was not a theoretical concern. It was a documented cause of barn and outbuilding collapses across the region every winter. And here was Calloway, with a roof made of bent hickory and old canvas, claiming it would hold under 2 or 3 feet of packed snow on top of the 3,000 pounds of sod already sitting on it. The arch answered this criticism, though it took a winter to prove it. An arch does not resist load the way a flat beam does. A flat beam bends under load, and if the load exceeds the beam's strength, it fractures at the center. An arch converts vertical load into outward thrust along its curve, pushing against its support points at the base rather than trying to carry the load in the middle. The wagon bows, set at a rise-to-span ratio of roughly 1 to 4, were operating well within the range where arch action dominates. They were not bending under the sod. They were pushing outward against the clay walls of the sinkhole, walls that were effectively immovable. The geometry of the structure made it stronger under load, not weaker. The more snow fell on the roof, the more firmly the arch pressed its base into the surrounding earth. The second criticism was dampness. A shelter dug into Kansas clay, the neighbors said, would be a mud hole by spring. The seasonal rains would seep through the sod, saturate the clay walls, and turn the floor into a slick, cold mire. The canvas would rot. The wagon bows would mold. The family would emerge from their winter burrow sick and half-frozen. This criticism had more validity than the structural one, and Calloway knew it. He addressed it with a drainage trench cut into the floor around the perimeter of the shelter, sloped toward a small collection pit dug into the corner farthest from the entry. Seepage that found its way through the sod and canvas drained into this pit, rather than spreading across the floor, and could be bailed out as needed. It was imperfect, The shelter was damp in spring, but it was not the mud disaster the neighbors had predicted. The third criticism, the one delivered with the most confidence and the least engineering basis, was about the smell. Living underground like an animal. The indignity of it. The wrongness of a human family sheltering in a hole in the ground like prairie dogs or badgers. This was not a structural argument. It was a social argument, and in the tight, mutually observant world of frontier settlement, social arguments carried real weight. A family's choices about their shelter were read as indicators of their character, their competence, their prospects. Calloway, from everything the surviving record suggests, did not argue back. He finished the shelter, moved his family in, and began the work of breaking his first acres before the ground hardened. The winter came in October of 1873 with characteristic plains ferocity, a week of false warmth followed by a hard drop to single digits and a 3-day wind that drove powdered snow through every gap in every surface structure within miles. Calloway's neighbor reported losing nearly all of the caulking in his frame cabin's north wall during that first cold snap, dropping his interior temperature to 38 degrees Fahrenheit on the worst night. He burned through his woodpile at a rate that alarmed him. Inside the sinkhole, Calloway wrote, the temperature did not fall below 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The stove was lit for warmth and cooking, but it was not running at capacity. It was comfortable, not elegant, not spacious, not the kind of home his wife had perhaps imagined when they left Ohio, but warm, genuinely, physically warm. By February, at least one of the neighboring families had begun digging. Spring on the Kansas plains arrives with a particular kind of violence that has no equivalent in the forested East. The collision of warm, moisture-laden air pushing north from the Gulf of Mexico with cold, dry, continental air pressing down from Canada produces an atmospheric instability that is almost a living thing. Fast-moving, unpredictable, and capable of generating rotating columns of air that touch the ground with forces no surface structure of the period could reliably withstand. The spring of 1874 was, by multiple accounts preserved in county records and newspaper archives of the period, an unusually severe cyclone season across central Kansas. The same atmospheric patterns that would contribute to the great grasshopper plague of that summer, a climatic disruption that devastated crop yields across the region, also produced a sequence of violent spring storms between late March and early June. The storm that tested Calloway's shelter came on a Tuesday evening in late April. Local oral accounts, recorded by County Historical Society in the early 1900s from elderly residents who had been children at the time, describe a sky that turned a particular shade of yellow-green in the early afternoon. The specific coloration that experienced plains dwellers associated with rotation in the clouds above. The wind dropped to almost nothing around 4 o'clock. The animals became agitated. By 5 o'clock, the rotation was visible to the naked eye, a dark, lowering mass moving in from the southwest at a speed that left almost no time for preparation. The surface structures in the area had standard options. Get low, get to a corner, get under something heavy, and hope. There were no purpose-built storm cellars on most claims of that period. Those would become standard construction practice in the region only after years of cyclone losses made their necessity undeniable. Families in frame cabins, typically sheltered in interior corners, sometimes under heavy tables, with whatever they could pull over themselves for protection. Calloway's family was already underground. What happened in the following 30 to 40 minutes? The duration of the storm's passage across that section of the county was described by Calloway himself in the most detailed portion of the surviving letter, a passage that reads with the compressed urgency of a man who understood how close the margin had been. The sound, he wrote, was not what he had expected. He had imagined something like a roar, like a freight train, the cliché of frontier storm accounts. What he heard instead, from inside the shelter, was a sustained, deep vibration, a pressure more than a sound, that he felt in his chest before he heard it in his ears. The sod above them shuddered once. A slow, heavy movement, and a small amount of loose clay fell from the joint where the roof met the south entry wall. One of the iron wheel rims, used as a roof anchor, shifted with a metallic scrape. And then, over perhaps 20 seconds, the pressure passed. The The silence that followed was, he wrote, the strangest thing he had ever experienced. Complete. Absolute. As if the world outside had simply stopped. When he pushed open the entry board and climbed out, he found the surface transformed. The neighbor's frame cabin, which had stood 200 yards to the east, was missing its roof entirely. The walls were standing but had been racked out of plumb, leaning away from the storm's path like a man leaning into a blow. A section of the board siding had been stripped clean. The stone well, the same one visible from Calloway's claim, had its wooden well cover and coping board carried off entirely. Calloway's shelter had lost 3 sod blocks from the windward edge of the roof, where the entry trench met the exterior grade. One of the iron anchor stakes had pulled loose. The canvas beneath the displaced sod was undamaged. The total repair time, he estimated, was less than 2 hours. The physics of what had happened, why the shelter survived when surface structures did not, was not something Calloway articulated in technical terms. He was a farmer, not an engineer, but he understood what he had seen, that the storm had passed over his shelter rather than through it, in a way that it had not passed over anything with vertical walls above the grade of the land. What Calloway had stumbled into, through necessity rather than formal study, was a principle that structural engineers who work on tornado-resistant design would recognize immediately. The relationship between a structure's vertical profile and the aerodynamic forces a high wind event can exert upon it. Wind, moving horizontally across the surface of the Earth, exerts pressure on vertical surfaces. The taller and broader a vertical surface, the greater the total force the wind can apply to it. A standard frame cabin of the 1870s, say 16 feet wide, 12 feet tall at the eave, with a steeply pitched roof adding another 6 or 7 feet of exposed gable, presented something in the range of 180 to 220 square feet of vertical surface area to a wind approaching from any given direction. In a cyclone, with wind speeds estimated at 100 to 130 miles per hour or more in the storm's most intense band, the force on those surfaces could reach tens of thousands of pounds. Forces that the mortise and tenon joinery, the cut nails, and the green lumber framing of a prairie cabin were simply not designed to resist. Calloway's shelter presented, at its maximum, approximately 18 square feet of vertical surface to the wind. The entry trench face, which was angled and partially recessed below grade, and the shallow arc of sod that rose 18 inches above the surrounding terrain. Not 180 square feet. 18. A reduction in exposed surface area of roughly 90% compared to a conventional surface structure of similar interior volume. The aerodynamics of the sod arch above the shelter also worked in its favor. An arch, presented to moving air, generates less aerodynamic drag than a flat surface of equivalent area. The air flows around and over the curved surface without creating the large pressure differential. High pressure on the windward face, low pressure on the leeward face, that is responsible for the suction effect that tears roofs off surface structures during high wind events. The rounded sod profile deflected the airflow rather than blocking it, reducing the net force on the structure to a fraction of what a flat-walled, flat-roofed building would experience. The sinkhole's depth provided a third layer of protection. The most violent air movement in a tornado is concentrated in the rotating column itself and in the surface-level outflow winds that precede and follow it. At 6 feet below grade, the shelter's interior was below the most turbulent layer of surface-level wind. The earth walls surrounding it were not just thermally protective. They were aerodynamically protective, placing the structure in a zone where wind velocity was dramatically lower than at the surface. This combination, minimal above-grade profile, curved aerodynamic form, below-grade placement, is not accidental from an engineering standpoint. It is, in fact, the theoretical basis for modern tornado shelters and FEMA-recommended safe room designs, which emphasize below-grade placement, reinforced construction, and minimal exposure above the surrounding grade. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's guidance on tornado shelters, developed over decades of research into storm damage patterns, arrives at conclusions that are structurally analogous to what Calloway built in 1873 from a wrecked wagon and a hole in the ground. He did not know the theory. He knew the result. The surviving account from that spring and the following years suggest that Callaway occupied the shelter for 3 full winters before converting it to a root cellar and storage space when he finally accumulated enough resources to build a proper stone and timber farmhouse. The shelter was never torn down. It was simply repurposed, its entry sealed, and its interior used for cold storage of vegetables and preserved food, a function for which its thermal stability made it nearly ideal. The sinkhole that no one had wanted had become, in sequence, an emergency shelter, a family home, and a permanent food storage system. 3 different uses, spanning the full arc of frontier settlement from desperate arrival to established farm, all from the same hole in the ground and the same pile of wreckage that had seemed, at first glance, like nothing at all. The story of Callaway's shelter is not unique. It is one example, unusually well documented by frontier standards, of a pattern that repeated itself across the Great Plains from the 1860s through the 1890s. The discovery, usually through desperation rather than design, that the earth itself was the most reliable building material available on the treeless prairie. The sod house, the sod die, became the iconic structure of plains settlement for exactly this reason. Sod blocks were free, available everywhere, relatively easy to cut and stack, and provided thermal performance that lumber, when it could be obtained, could not match at equivalent cost. A well-built sod die maintained interior temperatures within a narrower band than a comparable frame cabin through both summer heat and winter cold. The walls were thick, typically 2 to 3 feet, and the thermal mass of that much compacted earth and grass root was substantial. Soddies were dark and prone to leaking in heavy rain, and they required regular maintenance to prevent wall erosion. But as thermal shelters on a fuel-scarce landscape, they were genuinely effective. The dugout, a structure built below grade rather than on it, in the manner of Callaway's sinkhole shelter, was even more thermally efficient than a surface sod die, for the reasons outlined in his case. Oral accounts gathered from elderly plains settlers in the early 20th century consistently described dugouts as the warmest of the improvised frontier shelter types and the most wind-resistant. They were also the most vulnerable to flooding in low-lying areas and the most difficult to ventilate properly, which led to their gradual abandonment as settlers accumulated resources for surface construction. The irony, visible from a distance of 150 years, is this. The structures that frontier settlers built when they had no resources, the dugouts, the earth shelters, the sod-roofed half-underground rooms, were often thermally and structurally superior to the frame houses they aspired to build once they had money. The frame house was the symbol of success, of permanence, of having made it on the frontier. It was also drafty, fuel-hungry, and dangerously exposed to the storms that rolled across the plains with seasonal regularity. Modern building science has spent decades rediscovering what poverty forced the plains settlers to learn in their first winter. Earth-sheltered construction, structures built into hillsides or below grade, with sod or soil covering the roof, has been the subject of serious architectural and engineering study since the 1970s energy crisis, when rising fuel costs made the thermal efficiency of below-grade buildings suddenly relevant to people who weren't living on the frontier. The conclusions of that research largely confirm what the dugout settlers experienced empirically. Earth-sheltered structures maintain more stable interior temperatures, consume significantly less heating and cooling energy, and resist wind loads more effectively than equivalent above-grade structures. The FEMA guidance on tornado shelter placement, the passive house movement's emphasis on thermal mass, the growing interest in rammed earth, and earth-back construction among contemporary off-grid builders. All of these trace a direct conceptual line back to the same physical principles that a Kansas homesteader employed in the autumn of 1873, working alone with a team of oxen and a pile of broken wagon parts. He didn't have access to engineering manuals or university research. He had a hole in the ground, a family to keep alive, and a mind that was paying close attention to what the land was actually offering rather than what the conventions of the time said a shelter was supposed to look like. The Cyclone, when it came, made no distinctions about methods or intentions. It evaluated structures purely on physical terms, profile, geometry, mass, resistance. And the structure that had been built from nothing by someone with nothing from a plan that his neighbors had called foolish, that structure passed the evaluation that the others failed. The land had taught him. He had been willing to learn. And sometimes that is the entire difference. This screenplay is intended for historical and educational purposes only. It does not substitute for professional engineering or structural advice.